Very briefly, I'm going to introduce two people. One is my favorite person, and the other is my favorite congressman. So as you can probably guess, the first person I'm going to introduce is my lovely wife, Christiana, who's been in the... She has been working in the cause for longer than I have, and she has been a key partner for Mr. Loudermilk and the entire team, going back to the early days in the Bartow County GOP. And I also want to introduce your congressman and my congressman, Congressman Barry Loudermilk. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your passion.
Well, this is exciting. Mac, thank you. Thank you for being here. It is so fun. I didn't know how exciting of a party this was going to be. Thank you for being here tonight. And this is really different because tonight is actually the book launch for my dad's book, And Then They Prayed. And it's really unusual, I would say, to come somewhere and receive a book from an elected official and that book to not be about them. It's mostly, if you were to go somewhere with a U.S. congressman, you would be receiving their bio or maybe their vision for our nation. Nothing wrong with that. But this book actually doesn't mention you at all. This book, And Then They Prayed. I'm very familiar with it, of course, being your daughter. It is a fantastic book. But I'm sure there are some here who are not familiar with what it's about. And even the title tells you it's something special. It's And Then They Prayed. But I will say, it does sound like it's the conclusion of a bigger statement. There's something more to that title. So would you share with us what this book is about and what that title means?
Yeah, Christiana, you're exactly right. It is the end of a statement, and it is unique as a title. The book covers miraculous events that happened in our country from 1746 all the way up into the 20th century. There have been several books written about God's providence during our war for independence, but there weren't any that really went on through the several generations of our country, and so that was one of the reasons we wanted to publish this book. But the title is reflective of something that I saw constant throughout our history. And it was framed up very well by George Patton, which there's a chapter called Planning, Working, and Prayer. And those were the words of General George Patton as he was teaching his chaplain about the power of prayer. Now, people don't think about that with George Patton, but if you want to put it in a frame of reference, Donald Trump and George Patton have a lot of similarities in the way that they operate. But this was on the verge of just before the Battle of the Bulge. Patton was frustrated because the weather had stalled the Third Army in France. He wanted to already be in Germany, and he wanted to be the first into Berlin and take Hitler by himself. And he was really frustrated that they were stalled. So he had called his chaplain in to ask him, do we have an army prayer for good weather for battle? And the chaplain said, no, we don't. So he said, I want you to go write one. But he started explaining to his chaplain his experience with prayer. He said, look, we've been very fortunate. We have won many victories ever since we landed at D-Day. And that's because people back home have been praying for us, but that's not enough now. He said, there's three elements into actually achieving victory. There's planning, there's working, and then there's prayer. He said planning, we always do very extensive battle planning. And then we have to have well-trained soldiers to execute it. That's the working. But there is this void between victory and defeat. And he said that what you do in that void determines whether you win or lose. And that is God's realm. He said some people will call it luck. I call it God. And so he went on to explain the power of prayer is what really determines the outcome. And so that planning, working, and prayer that he mentioned, I started seeing it throughout our history. And so the title actually comes from, as I was looking through all these stories that every time that our liberty was threatened, Americans fought. They stood firm against fear. They even conquered the unknown, but then they prayed. And in every case, they closed that gap with prayer. And so that's the purpose of the title. And then they prayed.
That's awesome. And again, I am very biased towards this book. It's a fantastic book, and it is, correct me if I'm wrong, 14 short stories of how prayer has impacted our nation from Valley Forge to the Apollo 8 space mission. But what do you say? So this is about history. It's about our heritage.
Right.
What do you say to people who say, we shouldn't look at the past so much. We should be looking forward. Stop looking behind us. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd say you need to go look at our founders because they were adamant that to move forward, you have to look back. The book of Ecclesiastes 1:9 says, everything that will happen has already happened. There is nothing new under the sun. This was written in 1000 BC, 1,000 years before Christ. And the Bible's saying everything that you could be facing right now has already happened in the past. There's nothing that we as a nation or you as an individual are going through that somebody somewhere hasn't already been through. And so our founders took that, and if you go back and you look through, the first chapter is actually from 1746 when the French were going to invade Boston. Even then, they looked back. Well, who else in history has faced certain annihilation? Well, the children of Israel did. So what did they do? Our founders did that throughout. If you look at their Declaration of Independence, all right, the last line of the Declaration, because these men knew that what they were trying to attempt was impossible. There is no way this little ragtag army could defeat the most powerful military force in the history of the world. It's impossible. But they did it anyhow. And Thomas Jefferson wrote in the last line of the Declaration, he said, and in support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. What he's saying is, we know we can't do this, but we know who does specialize in the impossible. It's God. And then he said, but we're willing to give everything we have in defense of that. Years later, Jefferson was asked, where did he get the inspiration for that? And he said, in the book of Daniel, the 3 Hebrew children, they faced the same thing. It was certain annihilation. They were going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And they said, we believe God will deliver us, but if not, we still won't bow. And he said, that's basically what we were saying. So Jefferson looked back. John Adams there's a delegate, Benjamin Rush from Pennsylvania, was sitting next to John Adams during the debates in the Second Continental Congress of whether or not we should declare independence. And John Dickinson from Pennsylvania had delivered a very logical speech because he had gone back and he looked at what other nations who rebelled against England, what had happened to them. And so he's a realist saying, basically he says, I dare not even read the doomsday journals of America anymore. He was totally against it. But Benjamin Rush leaned over to John Adams and he said, I whispered to him and said, do you believe that we can actually win our war for independence? And he said, John Adams turned and said, if we ask for forgiveness of our sins and pray. He was going back, looking at the children of Israel who faced similar things and basically cited 2 Chronicles 7:14. You know the verse. If you humble yourself, and that God will forgive you of your sins and heal your land. So going back really is what we need to do to move forward.
That's so true, and I don't think I can count how many books on history I've read over my life. I think it was not just encouraged, but required, as you might imagine, being my father's daughter. But I will say, you are who I learned more about history from than any book, and I'm going to be honest, when you had come through your 10 years of research for this book, a lot of research went into this, and you brought us that manuscript and you asked, will you just sit down and read it and give me your feedback? Well, as my brothers will tell you, I am known for giving honest feedback. And I thought, I don't want to disappoint him because he's an incredible storyteller and he always makes me feel like I'm there at Valley Forge. And I loved the way that he would engage us in those stories, and I thought there's no way he can write it the same way he tells it, so I don't want to have to tell him it's bad. But finally I said, okay, he seems like it's really important to him. So I went out on the back porch and I started reading, and I just remember I was amazed at how well, and maybe I'll jump into that in a minute of what story I read, but you put years of research into this. Why were you willing to do that? Why did you write this book, and why publish it now?
Well, yeah, it took over 10 years of research because I didn't want to just follow the historical documents of George Washington. Everything in here is absolute fact. But everybody can go and look up the letters of George Washington, his journal that was at Valley Forge. Not that everybody would do it. But as she said, to make the story interesting, I wanted to put you there as if you're with George Washington and you're observing what's happening, you're feeling and you're hearing what's going on. The only way you can do that is research the people that were around them. And that's what took so much time. So you're basically with one of the lieutenants at Dorchester Heights, or you're inside the Bat, which is one of the planes of the Doolittle Raiders, as they're certainly doomed because of headwinds going across the China Sea. I wanted to put the reader there. So that's why it took so much time. And the reason that I felt that we needed to release this book this year is because we just started our 250th year. We're in our 250th year as a constitutional republic. And one reason is knowing the man that's in the White House. We're going to have one party next year on July 4th like you've seen before. But the other thing is, the big question is, how much longer can we last? Right? We have far exceeded any representative constitutional republic in the history of the world. No one has even come close to going this long. And as Reagan said, we're only one generation from losing everything, losing our freedom. So with the idea of what we talked about earlier, if we want to preserve our nation another 10, 20, 50, or 250 years, we need to know what preserved us for the first 250. And so that's what I think. It's important that people know these stories and know that God's providence not only was evident during the founding of our nation, but all the way up through. Several of you got copies here today, but the person who got the first copy of the book pre-release was Donald Trump. He called me to his office for a meeting, so we'd just gotten some of the pre-release copies in, so I took the first one to my meeting with him in the Oval Office and I handed it to him. And I had inscribed in it kind of a personal joke between us, which is to my favorite president, because every time he calls me, he's like, Barry, this is your favorite president. And so I inscribed it to my favorite president, someone who has experienced God's providence himself. And when he read that, he pointed to his ear and he said, if God hadn't told me to move my head right when I did. So he's well aware of that providence. And so that's why I think it's important now. And we want to get it into as many hands of people as we can.
Absolutely. And that day when you had given me the manuscript, I was dreading it a little bit, went on my back porch, and I just decided I'll just take the last chapter of the book. And it is still the last chapter of the book, chapter 14. And I started reading. And as I went through this account of Captain Nathan Hale, who was 21 years old when he gave his life on an apple tree as a spy for our country. And he was paraphrased in saying, my only regret is that I have one life to give for my country. I was 21 years old that day. And I just remember it was not hard to finish that story. I came back and told Dad, not only is this amazing, but this caused me to realize God can use me for so much. Even this man who only lived to be my age at that time, 21 years old, we still learn about today. We still hear about today. And I was so impacted by that. And I would encourage you, please don't take this book home and put it on a bookshelf. Read this book, but do it knowing it's going to move you and it's going to challenge you and it's going to cause you to want to take action. And as we're wrapping up, would you just quickly share, that is my favorite story in the book. Would you quickly share one of your favorite stories from this book?
Well, it's hard to pick out one because they're just so incredible, and it's not because I wrote them, it's because of the men who lived them. It's as much about them, and they're heroes, but they also know who controls the universe, and they know when to turn to him. And so, but the two that really stand out to me, because my dad's a World War II veteran, is Jacob de Shazer. He was the bombardier on the Doolittle Raiders. He was on the aircraft, the Bat. And what's incredible about his story is it's so much different perspectives of God's authority and power. He was not a Christian at the time. So his mom, who is in Oregon, while he's getting ready to bail out of his plane because they're out of fuel and he's in over Japan-controlled China, she wakes up in the middle of the night with this feeling that she's falling and needs to pray. Years later, they compared the time, and that was when he was diving out of the plane. He gets captured. He's imprisoned for the rest of the war. God converts him to Christianity because the only book that the Japanese had in English was a Bible. And so the prisoners would pass it along. But then there's also God's providence in this, because during all this, God calls him to come back to Japan as a minister. And he comes back and he leads a lot of people to Christ in Japan. But the strange thing is, it was who his ministry partner was, Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the raid on Pearl Harbor. So you see how God took two enemies and brought them together. And it's just a fabulous story. And the other one is really a favorite of mine because it's here from home. Mike Chokas just lives a few miles from where this happened. And it's at the Andersonville prison camp, where a miraculous event happened. Prisoners were dying at the rate of 100 a day because of disease and starvation. And there was 33,000 people in a camp that was built for max capacity of 10,000. They said the people in Andersonville could smell the stench from the camp. It was 10 miles away. A young private watched as one of his fellow soldiers was so crazed by thirst because there was no fresh water there. The only water was a sewage-laden stagnant creek called Stockade Creek, which the word was, if you want to get out of Andersonville, take a drink out of it because you'll be in the cemetery in 2 days. He was so crazed by thirst, he walked across the deadline, which is the line between the camp and the stockade wall, and if you crossed it, you were shot to death. And he watched as his friend was shot to death, and he knew he had to do something. So he called a prayer meeting at a place called the Tabernacle, where a tree had fallen down and there was nothing but a hole in the ground. And they started praying not to be released, not for victory in the Civil War, but that would God provide them water, fresh water. While they're praying, about an hour into their prayer, this was witnessed by thousands of people, okay? This is absolute truth. The skies darkened, it started to rain, and then a bolt of lightning struck the ground inside the stockade wall, and immediately a fountain of pure water erupted from there. What's so great about this story is you can take a 2.5 hour drive from here and you can see Providence Spring, which is still flowing today. And Mike told me when he was a kid they used to go drink out of it. So it's evidence of this that you can see yourself. And so besides it being at home, that's just one of the stories that you can actually go touch and feel. And at the gift shop there, the last time I was down there, you could buy little vials and you could go fill up some of the water and take it with you. I have actually a jar of that water on my desk at home right now. So
It's amazing. I remember you taking us there when I was about 12. Wow. So Nathan Hale, what I learned from that story is that that quote that he's paraphrased that you learn in school, that's not actually what he said.
No.
In fact, as he was being led those 30 feet to that apple tree, he walked with his head held high, confidently walking to his death. And the British soldiers that were there that day watched him and wondered of what confidence he had and why was he so dedicated. They gave him chance after chance to join their side and give them the information that they wanted from his time as a spy. But when he got to that apple tree, he turned around and they said, Captain Hale, do you have any last words? And he said, if I had 10,000 lives, I would give every one for my dying, bleeding country. This is why this matters. One of the British officers was so moved by his conviction, he resigned from the British Army and said, if I am fighting against an army with this conviction, I'm not even willing to continue. Men who believed, men and women who believed in their cause. That's why you wrote this book. That's what you taught me anyway. This is a book that we want you to take home and read because our nation is only one generation away from extinction. Our freedom is only one generation away. We have about 100 extra copies tonight for purchase in the back. This is not about you.
Right.
This is about the future. We don't want to go home with any because we want you to go home with several. Your children, your grandchildren, your Bible studies, your Sunday schools. This is we've had people use them for Sunday school classes. There are so many ways that this can be shared, and it's so different than a biography about an elected official. This is about the heritage of our nation, and is something that can inspire those to continue carrying the torch of freedom so that on our watch, it will not be extinguished. We would love for you to share this on social media, share the pictures from tonight, text it to as many people as you can and say, please read this book. It's available everywhere. It was actually released on Independence Day just 3 days ago. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being in this fight with us because we know, we plan, we work, and then we pray.
That's right.
Thank you for writing this book, Dad.
Thank you.
I can't tell you how much I know that I married up, and I'm talking about Christiana in particular. And we were speaking at a church together. This was about 5-6 months ago. And one of the people from the Sunday school class we were talking to came up and said, wow, you were good, but your wife was incredible. Could not agree more. That is absolutely factual. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. Please get information about the Victory Dinner before you leave, September 15th. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, please enjoy more of the refreshments, more of the beverages, and then we're also opening up the photo line once again. Thank you so much. I hit everything?
I think so. Just those who haven't got their book yet.
And if you haven't gotten your book yet, if you still have your card, come up here, form line right here. We'll get you taken care of. Thank you so much.